In the name of Allah Almighty, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It is lecture number 12 and today our topic of discussion is poets of the early Victorian age. The content that we have to discuss in this lecture are introduction, poets of the early Victorian period, Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, some minor poets, and then at the end there is conclusion. Starting with the introduction, the most important poets during the early Victorian period were Tennyson and Browning, with Arnold occupying a somewhat lower position. After the passing away of Keats, Shelley and Byron in the early 1820s, for about 15 years the fine frenzy of the high romantic subsided and a quieter mood ensued. When romantic age ended with the deaths of Keats, Shelley and Byron, for about 15 years there was no activity with respect to the literature, and that fine frenzy. Frenzy means the unusual situation and craze of the romantics that subsided means sidelined. It was put aside, and quieter mood ensued. Ensued means start, and there was a quieter mood for some 15 years. Yes, poets of the early romantic period are Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold. They are the most important poets of this era. Next we have Alfred Tennyson. Tennyson is the most representative poet of the Victorian age. His poetry is a record of the intellectual and spiritual life of the time. He is the representative poet. It means that when we hear about Victorian age and when we talk about Victorian age, he is the one who comes in our mind, that Alfred Tennyson is the poet who belongs to this age. His poetry is a record of the intellectual and spiritual life of that time. So his poetry shows the intellect, the spirit of that time. Darwin's theory of evolution, which believed in the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, especially upset and shook the foundations of religious faith. Thus there was a conflict between science and religion, doubt and faith, materialism and spirituality. At that time there occurred the development in science, and as a result people's concept of the thing started changing. So there was a drastic change which took place at that time, and I have also discussed about it in my previous lecture, that there was a scientific revolution. As a result, the mortality rate was reduced, and there was the development and invention of many medicines which helped human to survive for a longer period of time. There was also a Darwin's theory of evolution, and which believed that struggle for existence. Those who struggle for existence, they exist. Those who do not struggle, they just left aside. And the survival of the fittest. Only those people survive who just get themselves fit into the situation. So this theory, it basically upset and shook the foundations of religious faith. Religious faith was everyone will be provided by the God, and there is no concept of the struggle and the survival of the fittest. So that was the religious faith. So this theory came in totally contrast to the religious faith, because there was a conflict between science and religion. So there occurred this conflict and doubt and faith. So people started doubting each and everything, and even they started doubting about the existence of the God. So a lot of things happened at that time. There was materialism, that people started pursuing the material things. They wanted to get the material things in their lives, and spirituality, and there was diminishing effect of the spirituality. As a result, this Darwin's theory of evolution and conflict between the science and religion, that changed the whole social system and the thought patterns of the society, and people started moving. And with the invention and with the industrial revolution, when people shifted from rural to the urban area, so there occurred change in the family structure, the way people used to look at the life. So everything started changing. So this impact was also found in the poetry of the Victorian poets. Yes, what are the characteristics of his poetry? He is perhaps, after Milton, the most conscientious and accomplished poetic artist in English literature. Conscientious mean painstaking, the one who just work with great care and great effort. And he's accomplished means complete poetic artist in English literature. In poetic style, he has shown a uniform mastery which is not surpassed by any other English poet except Shakespeare. So he has the mastery, that kind of uniform mastery that is of Shakespeare. As an artist, Tennyson has an imagination less dramatic than lyrical. So he is not dramatic. He does not talk about the situations. He does not create a situation in his poem. Rather, he is lyrical. He just involve or incorporate the musical effect in the poetry. When you read his poetry, you feel like you are listening or you are reading lyrics of the song. And he is usually at his best when he is kindled by personal emotion and personal experience. So his best works contains his personal emotion and personal experience. It means that he was basically very much expert in explaining or in conveying his personal emotion and personal experience, which make him a great poet. During his lifetime, Tennyson was considered as the greatest poet of his age, but after his death, a reaction started against him and he was given a much lower rank among the English poets. So during his lifetime, he was just the greatest poet of his age, and after his death, so there occurred a reaction against him, and he was given a much lower rank among the English poets. So that is why we do not know his name among the most important poets of the English literature, like Keats, like Shakespeare, like Donne. Okay, so although he is there, he was a great poet when he was alive, but after that he did not enjoy that fame. His important works are Memoriam, Locksley Hall, The Princess Maud, Idylls of Kings. Next we have Robert Browning. During his lifetime, Browning was not considered as great a poet as Tennyson. But after that, the opinion of the critic has changed in favor of Browning, who, on account of his depth and originality of thoughts, is ranked superior to Tennyson. So there is a totally opposite level of the fame between of the Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson. Why? Because Tennyson was famous when he was alive, but after his death, his popularity decreased. And who is there to decide the popularity? There are the critics who decide that which poet is to be considered great, and because of his genius, because of his work, because of his intellect, his style, everything is considered and everything is measured, and on the basis of that, they are considered great or just the mediocre poets. So Robert Browning, although in his life he was not as famous as was Tennyson, but after his death his popularity increased, and the critics put him as and declared him as a poet superior to the Tennyson. Yes, there is comparison between Tennyson and Robert Browning. In their respective messages, the two poets differed widely. Yes, in their messages, the way they used to communicate. For example, Tennyson talked about the personal experience, personal opinions, personal emotions, while Browning talked about, although he talked about the personal experience, but the personal experience of someone else. For example, he talked about the last Duchess. He talked about, Bishop ordered his storm, and Bishop is some third person who just ordered his storm. So it means that these are the names of his poems. It means that he talked about the perspective of some other person, while Tennyson talked about the perspective of his own. So there are two different messages conveyed by these two poets. Tennyson's message reflects the growing order of the age and is summed up in the word law. He talks about the growing order of the age. He believes in disciplining the individual will and subordinating it to the universal law. He said that one should discipline one's individual will, and he believed that one should be subordinate to the universal law. It means that what is there one in the nature, one should follow the nature, one should follow the God, one should follow the commandments as sent by the God. So he believed that man's own opinion, man's own will should be subordinate to the will of the God. There is not a resignation struck in his poetry which amounts to Fatalism. Fatalism means acceptance and then submission or subjugation in front of the God, and believing that what happens in life is based on God's plans, and it is because of the God's will that we have this present, and then we will have the future. So we find resignation stuck in his poetry, which amounts to acceptance, and fatalism not should not be. It should not be there. It is mistakenly here. Okay, Browning, on the other hand, advocated the triumph of the individual will over the obstacles. So Browning believes that individual will can help him overcome the obstacles. Obstacles means barriers, barriers to success. Whatever barrier you find in your life, it can be overcome because of the individual will. Browning believed in that, but he did not submit it to God, and he did not believed that whatever happens, it happened from the God. He had a completely opposite view with respect to the God's will as compared to the Tennyson. In his opinion, self is not subordinate but supreme. According to Browning, yeah, individual self is not subordinate. The individual self is supreme because God has given this individual self, a thought, a mind, and he had the power to change the world. So there is a robust optimism reflected in all his poetry. Robust means active, optimism means positive. So there is active positivism reflected in all his poetry. So he presents the positive side of the life, positive attitude regarding things, and he believes and he says that one should stay positive in all the things, and one should follow the will of the mind. One individual self is supreme, and one should make one's own way towards success. In another way, also Browning presents a contrast to Tennyson's. Whereas Tennyson's genius is mainly lyrical, Browning's is predominantly dramatic. Lyrical, again, I have already repeated, I have already explained, so I'm going to repeat it once more, that lyrical is a kind of poem in which there is a musical effect. So Browning's predominantly is dramatic. Dramatic is a kind of situation in which, it is also a kind of poem in which there's a situation where a character talks about the story. And his greatest poems are written in the form of the dramatic monologue. Dramatic means in the form of a drama, and and monologue means talking to oneself, means an imaginary character is there who talks to himself about certain situation. Like Bishop orders his tomb, so Bishop is going to order his tomb where he will be buried later on after his death. So he's going to order his tomb, and in that he just communicates only his tomb. So that is what is called as dramatic monologue. There's an imaginary situation, there's an imaginary character who talks about that particular situation. Okay, so here we have the important works of Browning: Pauline, Paracelsus, Sordello, and Pepper Passes, and there's also a Bishop orders his tomb. Flaws in his poetry. The chief fault of Browning's poetry is obscurity. Obscurity means something which is not clear, or you can say unclear. There is unclarity in his poetry. This is mainly due to the fact that his thought is often so obscure or subtle that language cannot express it perfectly. Subtle means indirect. Okay, so his thought is basically obscure, it is unclear, and it is subtle. Subtle means indirect. The language cannot express it perfectly. When your thoughts are clear, your language is clear. When your thoughts are not clear, your language is not clear. So that was the flaw in his poetry, that his thoughts were not clear. As a result, whatever he expressed, it was not expressed perfectly. Being interested in the study of the individual soul, never exactly alike in any two men, he seeks to express the hidden motives and principles which govern individual action. Because he was interested in studying the individual soul, and he believed that the individual will is supreme, so he expressed the hidden motives and principles which govern the individual action. So whatever action the person had carried out, it was presented by Robert Browning in his poetry. And mostly what happens that if he talked about the two different persons in his poetry, and if he talked about the two different men in two different poems. So their motives and their um, ideas, their soul, whatever he talked about that individual, they were not alike. They were completely different. So that is the flaw in his poetry. Thus, in order to understand his poems, the reader has always to be mentally alert. So, in order to get the meaning out of his poems, that what is his purpose, that what idea, what thought he wants to convey, the reader should be very active and he should be mentally alert. Otherwise, he fails to understand his fine shades of psychological study. So, he need to be mentally alert. Otherwise, he cannot understand the shades of his psychological study. So, definitely there is psychological element in it when you cannot convey your thoughts clearly, when you cannot convey your language clearly. So that is makes your study a psychological study. Last we have Matthew Arnold. Another great poet of the early Victorian period is Matthew Arnold. Though he is not as so great as Tennyson and Browning, unlike Tennyson and Browning, he came under the influence of romantic poets. There's a comparison between Tennyson and Browning because they were almost equally important and equally famous. But there is no comparison of Matthew Arnold with them because Matthew Arnold was not as much famous as they both had enjoyed the fame. Unlike Tennyson and Browning, who came under the influence of romantic poets, Tennyson and Browning came under the influence of the romantic poets. Arnold, through a great admirer, he was a great admirer of Wordsworth, reacted against the ornate and fluent romanticism of Shelley and Keats. So he was not admirer of romanticism. Tennyson and Browning had a positive attitude toward the romanticism. They were in favor of the romantic poets. They liked the romantic poets. Unlike Matthew Arnold, although liked the influence of the romantic poets like Wordsworth, he was a great admirer of Wordsworth, but he was against the Shelley and Keats because of their ornate and fluent style. Ornate means decorated, so their decorated style because they used imagery, like Keats has used imagery in his poetry, he has used sensuousness. There were many literary devices that were employed by these poets in order to make their works, present the decoration, and they were fluent as well. He strove is a third form of strive means to struggle. He strove to set up a neoclassical ideal as against the romantic. He struggled to set up the neoclassical of the 18th century. He tried to set that ideal and he was against the romantics. Most of the poetry of Arnold gives expression to the conflict of the age between spontaneity and discipline, emotion and reason, faith and skepticism. Spontaneity means the quality of being true to nature, like following your own nature, own way of doing things, and discipline. Emotion and reason, faith and skepticism. Skepticism is doubt. So his poetry gives expression to the conflict of the age, like he talks about two contrasting things: doing things without thinking, that is spontaneity, then discipline, like going planned. Emotion and reason both are contrast. So he talks about this contrast in his poetry. Being distressed by the unfaith, disintegration, complexity and melancholy of his time. Melancholy means sadness. Disintegration means destruction or breaking down of something. Arnold longed for primitive faith, wholeness, simplicity and happiness. He was dissatisfied and distressed of the unfaith. People were losing faith. There was disintegration among the classes. There was complexity. There was sadness of the time. Rather, Arnold longed. He wished for the old faith, old completeness, old simplicity and happiness. So he was neoclassical and he favored the neoclassical ideas. Yes, characteristics of his poetry: he looks for high seriousness in poetry, which means the combination of the finest art with the fullest and deepest insight, such as is found in the poetry of Homer, Dante and Shakespeare. So he looked for the high seriousness in the poetry, which means a combination of finest art and deep insight. So seriousness is that you just present something beautifully, having the fine art, and deep insight. Deep insight means having the deep idea, an idea that that affect people, such as is found in the poetry of Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. So they were the great poets. He had that seriousness in his poetry. Arnold's own poetry was greatly affected by his political theories, and we find that whereas Tennyson's poetry is ornate and Browning's grotesque, Arnold's poetry, on the other hand, is plain and prosaic. Matthew Arnold was a critic as well, and his theory is affected by his critical theories, while in Tennyson we find that his poetry is ornate, that is decorated, while Browning's poetry is grotesque, which means that irregularity, no uniformity in his poetry, and sometimes it appears ugly as well. Arnold's poetry, on the other hand, is plain and prosaic, and his poetry is plain and prosaic. Prosaic means ordinary, not having the literary devices in the poetry. It is just plain and simple. His important works are Forsaken, Moorman, Dover Beach, Summer Night, the Memorial Verses. There were some minor poets at that time as well, and they were not as famous as Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, and Robert Browning, but they were there. Their names are Elizabeth Barrett and Arthur Hugh Clough. The early Victorian poetry or the high school poetry does not have the topic, the love and worship of nature. They did not talk about the worship, they did not talk about the love of the nature as the Romantics had in their poetry. It is because the Romantics loved nature and it was shown through their poems adoring and blessing nature as if it were God. Romantics loved nature, that is why nature was an important theme, an important topic of subject in the poetry of Romantic poets. While in Victorian poetry we do not find such elements, rather they had the different concepts. Alright, Robert Browning was the lover of music. Alfred Lord Tennyson stood as the summit of poetry in England. Summit means at the highest point, so he stood at the highest point of the poetry in England. Matthew Arnold was a poet as well as critic. So they had different characteristics and they had wrote poetry with different perspectives. They had different style if we compare it with the Romantic poets. So that's all.